I used to think there were some things a woman would never sell. Her name, her dignity, her future, her body, the parts of herself that were supposed to belong only to her. But that was before Elena Hayes stood in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, staring at a doctor who had just told her that if her mother didn't get surgery soon, time would start working against them. It was before the bank called to say the house was days away from foreclosure. It was before she found herself sitting across from a woman in a glass office who slid a contract over the table and offered her enough money to save everything in exchange for one thing Elena had never imagined putting a price on. Years later, when people would hear the story, they would ask the same question in different ways. How could she do it? How could any woman sign away something so intimate to a stranger? But those questions usually come from people who have never had to choose between their conscience and the person they love most in the world. Elena was 29, exhausted, and living a life that looked ordinary enough from the outside. She worked long shifts at a private care facility outside Chicago, came home to a modest house with old wood floors and a roof that leaked during heavy rain, and spent most evenings helping her mother sort pills into a weekly container while pretending not to notice how much weight Ruth Hayes had lost. Ruth had been a widow for nearly 15 years. She had spent most of Elena's childhood working jobs that left her hands cracked and her back aching, but she never complained. She had the kind of pride that made her hide pain until pain was too large to hide. When the doctors found the mass in her abdomen, Ruth tried to treat it like an inconvenience. She laughed in the exam room and told Elena not to make that face, told her she'd survived worse, told her women like her didn't go down easy. But the laugh never reached her eyes, and the truth arrived in pieces that got harder to ignore. The surgery was urgent. The treatment afterward would be expensive. The insurance would cover almost nothing. And the disease did not care how decent or hardworking Ruth Hayes had been. For the first few weeks, Elena did what most daughters would do. She sold what little she had. She emptied her savings account. She picked up extra shifts. She called old friends she hadn't spoken to in years and asked if they could lend her anything at all. She maxed out her credit cards. She delayed her own bills. She skipped meals when she had to. She learned how humiliation can become routine when someone you love is slipping away and money is the only language the world seems willing to hear. Then came the second blow. The house Elena had grown up in, the house her father had painted by hand one summer before he died, was no longer safe either. Ruth had taken out a second mortgage years earlier after her husband's death and never told Elena how bad it had become. She had been making minimum payments, missing some, catching up when she could, and hiding every late notice before Elena got home. By the time the truth came out, the bank had already started the process. Elena was not just trying to save her mother. She was trying to save the only place that still held the shape of her family. The offer came through a woman named Lydia Voss, though at the time Elena didn't know why anyone like Lydia would even know her name. Lydia was polished in a way that made everything around her feel cheaper. Her voice was calm, her suit perfectly tailored, her expression carefully neutral, like she had spent years learning how to discuss deeply personal things without letting any emotion touch her face. She invited Elena to an office downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the city that made Elena feel small before the conversation even began. There was no small talk, no attempt to soften the ground. Lydia folded her hands and told Elena she represented a private client who was looking for a surrogate under conditions that would not involve an agency, public paperwork, or outside attention. The arrangement, Lydia explained, would be fully legal, medically supervised, and highly confidential. Then she pushed a folder across the table. Elena opened it and saw a number that made her stop breathing for a second. It was enough to pay for Ruth's surgery, clear the debt on the house, and leave room for the kind of security Elena had never known. She looked up at Lydia and asked the only question that mattered. "What's the catch?" Lydia didn't rush the answer. She simply explained the terms as if she were reading from a menu. If Elena passed the medical screening and psychological evaluation, she would carry a child for the client. The embryo would be created through IVF. The pregnancy would be monitored by a private medical team. The compensation would be paid in stages, with a significant amount released immediately upon signing and more after confirmation of a viable pregnancy. But there was one condition Elena couldn't shake. If she accepted, she would have to move into the client's estate until the early stages of the pregnancy were secure. She would be expected to remain there under medical observation, with limited outside contact and strict privacy. Elena stared at Lydia and asked why any of that was necessary. Lydia's answer was short enough to sound rehearsed. My client values control. That should have been the end of it. A decent woman with options would have stood up, thanked her for her time, and walked out of the office. But desperation does not behave like dignity. Desperation doesn't care whether something feels humiliating if humiliation comes with a check large enough to keep a mother alive. So Elena agreed to the screenings. She told herself she was gathering information. She told herself she hadn't said yes. 3 days later, Lydia called and said the client had chosen her. His name was Arthur Blackwood, and Elena already knew enough about the Blackwood name to understand that whatever world she was stepping into was not a normal one. Arthur came from the kind of money that seemed to exist outside the laws of ordinary life. His family owned a biotech empire with research centers, pharmaceutical holdings, and enough political influence to make headlines disappear when they wanted them to. Arthur himself had once been a fixture in business magazines and charity galas, the brilliant heir with a sharp mind and a colder reputation. Then 5 years earlier, there had been a car accident on a rain-slick highway outside Boston. Arthur survived. His fiancée did not. The crash left him with permanent spinal damage and a public image that changed overnight from ruthless young billionaire to tragic recluse. He withdrew from interviews, stopped appearing at events, and began running most of his company from a private estate outside the city. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors when wealthy people vanish from view. Some said he was unstable. Some said grief had turned him cruel. Some said he no longer trusted anyone outside a tiny circle of employees and lawyers. Elena didn't know what to believe. She only knew that the contract carried his name, the money was real, and her mother's surgery date was getting closer. The night Elena arrived at Blackwood House, she almost turned back before the gates opened. The estate was not the kind of place most people would call a home. It looked like a fortress built by someone who wanted beauty without warmth, luxury without comfort, silence without peace. There were iron gates taller than the trees around them, long stretches of stone, dark windows reflecting the sky like polished mirrors, and a driveway so long it gave Elena too much time to wonder what kind of man needed that much distance between himself and the rest of the world. Inside, the house was even more intimidating. Everything gleamed. The floors, the glass, the metal fixtures, the framed art on the walls. It was expensive in every direction and somehow still felt empty. A woman in a charcoal dress showed Elena to her room and explained the rules in a voice so smooth it sounded memorized. Meals could be sent up if she preferred privacy. Some parts of the house were restricted. All media contact was forbidden. Outside visitors would require approval. Medical staff would check on her daily. Nothing about the arrangement was to be discussed with household employees. By the time the woman left, Elena felt less like a guest and more like she had checked into a luxury prison. She met Arthur that evening, and the first sight of him unsettled her more than she expected. He was in the library, positioned near a fireplace that threw a low amber glow across shelves of leather-bound books and polished wood. He sat in a wheelchair with one hand resting on the armrest and the other loosely around a glass. He didn't seem interested in drinking. He was younger than Elena had imagined, maybe late 30s, with dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of face that would have been striking even if pain hadn't carved something severe into it. He looked at her the way some people read a contract, carefully, silently, searching for weak points. There was no welcoming smile, no attempt to put her at ease. He simply said her name, Elena Hayes, like he was confirming the delivery of something he had ordered. She answered with Mr. Blackwood, and one corner of his mouth shifted just enough to suggest amusement. Arthur, he said, if you're going to live in my house, we can skip the part where we pretend this is normal. Elena sat across from him, every nerve in her body aware of the fact that she was alone in a stranger's home about to sign the most personal contract of her life. He asked if she had read everything. She said yes. He asked why she still came. She told him the truth because there was no point pretending. I need the money. He held her gaze for a moment, then said quietly, good. I prefer honesty. This arrangement already has enough lies in it. There was something unnerving about Arthur because he was not what Elena had prepared herself for. She had expected a predator in a tailored suit, someone who would use charm or intimidation to remind her of the imbalance between them. Arthur didn't do either. He was colder than charm and more dangerous than open cruelty, because his restraint made him impossible to read. He could say something cutting without raising his voice. He could go silent in a way that made everyone around him tense. And yet there were moments, brief enough to doubt, when another version of him surfaced. During the contract meeting, after Lydia reviewed the final pages and Elena's hand shook over the signature line, Arthur looked at her and said, "If you want to walk out right now, do it before the pen touches the paper. Once this begins, it gets harder." It wasn't a threat. If anything, it sounded like a warning. Elena signed anyway. She thought about Ruth lying in a hospital bed trying to make jokes through the pain. She thought about the foreclosure notice folded in her purse. She thought about all the choices poverty takes away before anyone can call them choices at all. By the time the last page was signed, the first payment was already being processed. She had sold the next year of her body, and there was no clean way to think about it. The days that followed settled into a routine so controlled it almost felt unreal. There were blood tests, consultations, medication schedules, dietary plans, and private nurses who entered Elena's room with the politeness of hotel staff and the authority of prison guards. Arthur was rarely around during the daytime. He worked from an office wing on the other side of the house, took calls behind closed doors, and moved through the estate with the guarded focus of a man who had learned to ration both his energy and his trust. Elena began hearing stories about him the way people in large houses hear stories about storms that pass through before they arrived. One of the older housekeepers told her in a whisper that Arthur used to spend whole nights in the music room after the accident, sitting in the dark beside the piano his fiancée had played. A driver mentioned that Arthur had fired a board member for speaking to him like his disability made him weak. Lydia, when pressed, would reveal almost nothing except practical facts. Arthur had inherited the company after his father's death. Arthur disliked being pitted. Arthur did not forgive betrayal. Arthur preferred order because pain had made unpredictability unbearable. Little by little, Elena started to understand that the estate wasn't just a display of wealth. It was a structure built around one man's attempt to control a life that had once fallen apart without warning. The embryo transfer took place less than 2 weeks after Elena moved in. By then she had learned the strange rhythm of Blackwood House, the times when staff disappeared into the background, the quiet hours when the place seemed to hold its breath, the nights when she could hear Arthur's wheelchair moving through the hallway long after everyone else had gone to bed. He slept very little. Pain, she would later learn, had a way of turning rest into a negotiation and darkness into a companion. The procedure itself was clinical, efficient, and almost absurdly unemotional considering the stakes. Doctors spoke in calm tones. Nurses adjusted monitors, and Lydia stood nearby with a tablet in her hand, as if she were supervising a merger rather than the beginning of a pregnancy that would tie together two strangers from opposite ends of the world. When it was over, Elena returned to her room and lay still with one hand on her stomach, trying to make sense of the fact that something had already changed, even if she couldn't feel it yet. Hours later, there was a knock at her door. Arthur almost never came to her room, which was why the sound immediately put her on edge. When she opened it, he was holding a small velvet box. Elena stared at the box and asked what it was. Arthur said it was a thank you, and the word made her bristle. "I'm not your mistress," she told him. His face tightened, not with anger exactly, but with something more complicated. "I know that," he said. "Then don't buy me," she replied. For a second she thought he might snap back, but instead he set the box on a nearby table and looked at it rather than at her. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She wanted the woman I married to have it one day. Caroline never got the chance." Elena looked at him, confused by the sudden intimacy of the confession. Arthur's eyes stayed on the box. "I'm not trying to pay you. I just thought maybe this house has already taken enough from women." The sentence landed harder than she wanted it to. It stripped away the clean lines she had been drawing in her mind between employer and employee, contract and compassion, transaction and grief. When she finally opened the box, she found a delicate gold bracelet with a small emerald set into the center. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't even especially modern. It felt old, personal, and far too meaningful for a man who claimed this arrangement was practical. By the time Elena looked up, Arthur was already turning away, leaving her alone with the bracelet and the uncomfortable realization that the real danger in that house might not be what he could take from her, but what he could make her feel. The shift between them happened so slowly Elena didn't notice it until she was already inside it. It started one stormy night when she couldn't sleep and went downstairs to make tea. She found Arthur in the kitchen alone, trying to reach a glass on a high shelf and failing in a way that made both of them freeze with embarrassment. Elena stepped forward, handed him the glass, and made some quiet remark about him fighting with furniture at midnight. To her surprise, he let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. It was the first time she had seen him caught off guard by anything ordinary, and something about that moment loosened the tension that had defined every conversation between them. After that, they began crossing paths more often in the late hours when the house was quiet enough to make honesty feel safer. Arthur started asking about Ruth. At first it sounded like courtesy, but Elena noticed he remembered details. He knew the date of her surgery consultation. He remembered which medication made her nauseous. He even remembered Elena once saying that Ruth hated hospitals because they smelled like endings. In return, Elena learned things about Arthur that he never volunteered directly, but sometimes let slip in fragments. His fiancée, Caroline, had wanted children. His family had treated his disability like a problem to be hidden rather than a life to be lived. After the accident, he had spent months in rehab learning how to do basic things again while mourning the woman he was supposed to marry. He never said he was lonely, but loneliness hung around him so heavily it barely needed words. By the time the doctors confirmed that the embryo transfer had worked, Elena was no longer able to pretend Arthur was just a wealthy stranger renting her body. The pregnancy was viable. The first stage of the contract had succeeded. Lydia was pleased in the cool, professional way of a woman who viewed outcomes as boxes to be checked. The medical team adjusted Elena's care plan. Staff moved around the house with a new alertness, as if the possibility of an heir had turned the estate into a different place overnight. Elena should have felt relieved. The money had already begun saving Ruth. The bank had halted the immediate foreclosure action. Everything she had come there for was finally within reach. Instead, she felt something closer to dread, because success made the arrangement real in a way paperwork never had. It was no longer hypothetical. There was a life inside her that belonged, by contract, to the Blackwood future. That same week, Arthur's sister arrived, and the fragile balance Elena had been living in collapsed almost instantly. Vivian Blackwood was the kind of woman who made cruelty look polished. She arrived in a dark sedan just before lunch, wearing pearls and a cream-colored coat, and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that the world was arranged for her benefit. She greeted Arthur with a kiss on the cheek and Elena with a glance so cold it felt like a verdict. "So this is her," she said, and the room changed. Arthur's jaw tightened immediately. He told Vivian to watch herself, but she ignored him and turned her attention fully to Elena. She asked questions that weren't really questions. How old was she? Had she always worked in care facilities? Was her mother's illness the reason she accepted the arrangement, or had debt already pushed her to this point? The tone was smooth, almost conversational, which somehow made it more humiliating. Vivian wasn't interested in understanding Elena. She was stripping her down in public, making sure everyone in the room understood exactly how vulnerable and outmatched she was. Then she said the thing Arthur couldn't let pass. "Women with no power are always easiest to rescue," she remarked. "And men like my brother have always loved confusing rescue with ownership." Arthur slammed his hand against the arm of his wheelchair and told her to leave. But Vivian hadn't come for a family visit. She had come with lawyers. By evening, Blackwood House no longer felt tense. It felt under siege. Arthur's family was challenging the arrangement, not because they were outraged on Elena's behalf, but because the existence of a legal heir threatened the balance of power inside the Blackwood empire. If Arthur had a child, especially one recognized through a carefully structured contract, it would shift inheritance lines, voting influence, and the long-term control of family assets. Elena had never cared about any of that, but now she was standing in the center of it. Lawyers arrived. Doors closed. Voices sharpened. Lydia stopped pretending everything was under control. Then the story leaked. A tabloid site ran a piece hinting that reclusive billionaire Arthur Blackwood had secretly bought a woman to carry his child. Within hours, the article spread. Photos of the estate gates appeared online. Anonymous sources described Elena as a desperate nobody who had sold herself to a damaged rich man. Comment sections filled with strangers who knew nothing about her and yet felt entitled to call her greedy, disgusting, shameless, and worse. She stopped looking at her phone after the first few hundred messages. Shame is one thing when it belongs to you. It becomes something else entirely when thousands of strangers begin shaping it into entertainment. The stress hit her body faster than anyone expected. Elena woke in the middle of the night with pain so sharp it stole the air from her lungs. When she reached down and saw blood on the sheets, time seemed to split. For 1 second, she was no longer in a billionaire's mansion. She was just a woman in the dark, terrified that the choice she had made to save her mother had turned into something even more devastating. The house exploded into motion. Nurses were called. Lights came on. Someone ran for the doctor on overnight duty. Arthur was the first person through the door, and Elena would remember his face for the rest of her life. He looked at the blood, then at her, and whatever distance he had spent months protecting vanished in a single expression. It wasn't panic in the dramatic sense. It was worse. It was the look of a man realizing that something he had tried to control had become something he could lose. By the time the doctor examined her, Elena was shaking so hard she could barely answer questions. The verdict was a threatened miscarriage. Not a certainty. Not yet. But the risk was real. She needed complete rest, no stress, no upheaval, and no more public pressure. Arthur left the room without saying a word. What happened next was the first time Elena saw what Arthur Blackwood could do when fear overtook caution. Security doubled at the gates. Lawyers were summoned back in the middle of the night. Vivian was formally barred from the property. Lydia began coordinating damage control with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for Arthur to stop pretending this was merely a business arrangement. Through all of it, Arthur stayed in Elena's room. He sat beside her bed in the dark hours before dawn, saying almost nothing, his chair angled close enough that she could hear the quiet mechanical shift every time he moved. When Elena woke near 3 in the morning and found him still there, she whispered that he didn't have to stay. He looked exhausted, stripped of the cool precision he usually wore like armor. "Yes," he said, "I do." When she asked why, he was silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Then he said, "Because if anything happens to you, I'll know I'm the reason. Not the baby. You." The word hung between them, changing everything. Arthur turned away slightly, as if tenderness embarrassed him, and admitted what Elena had already begun to suspect. He had convinced himself that because she signed the contract, the arrangement was fair. But sitting beside her hospital bed, seeing what fear had done to her body, he could no longer hide from the truth. A choice made under desperation is not the same as freedom. Then he reached into his jacket and placed a folder on the blanket beside her. Elena opened it with trembling hands and found a revised agreement. Full payment would be transferred regardless of whether she remained at the estate. Ruth's treatment and the house debt would be covered immediately. If Elena wanted to end the pregnancy, walk away from the arrangement, or disappear from Arthur Blackwood's world forever, there would be no penalties and no legal retaliation. He was releasing her. At first, Elena couldn't process what she was reading. She looked up at him and asked if he meant it. Arthur nodded once. "I should have done it sooner," he said. She asked about the baby, and his face changed in a way she would never forget. He looked like a man swallowing grief before it had fully formed. "If you choose to continue, I'll support you," he told her. "If you don't, I won't ask you to sacrifice yourself to fix what's broken in me." In that moment, Arthur did something none of the money in his family could have bought. He gave Elena back the one thing the contract had taken from the beginning, a real choice. And because life has a cruel sense of timing, he gave it to her only after she had already begun to love him. Elena left the estate 2 days later. Not because she hated Arthur. Not because the money had stopped matching. She left because she needed to know who she was outside the gates of Blackwood House. Outside the fear, the contract, the pressure, and the strange tenderness that had grown in a place it never should have. The money hit her account exactly as promised. Ruth's surgery was scheduled and paid for. The foreclosure process was halted. For the first time in months, Elena slept in her childhood bedroom without feeling panic crawl through her chest. But peace didn't arrive with the relief. Instead, every quiet moment brought Arthur back to her in pieces she couldn't shake. The way he remembered details about her mother. The way he looked the night of the miscarriage scare. The bracelet from his mother sitting in her drawer like proof that whatever existed between them had become something neither contract language nor family lawyers could explain. Elena tried to tell herself it was only trauma, only proximity, only the emotional confusion that happens when one person saves another at the exact moment they're also hurting them. But there are some truths that survive every practical explanation, and the truth was simple. She missed him. 3 weeks later, Ruth was recovering well enough to notice that her daughter had started drifting through rooms like someone listening for a voice she couldn't hear anymore. Elena lied badly when her mother asked if there was a man involved. Ruth, who had spent a lifetime reading the expressions Elena thought she hid, told her that some choices are not about what looks respectable from the outside. Sometimes, she said, the hardest thing is admitting you loved someone in the middle of a mess. That was all it took. Elena drove into the city the next morning and went to Arthur's corporate office, not the estate. She wanted neutral ground. No gates, no marble halls, no shadows of the contract lingering in every room. Arthur was behind his desk when she walked in, thinner than she remembered and visibly startled in a way that almost made him look younger. He tried to stand before pain stopped him, and Elena saw embarrassment flash across his face at the reflex. Then he said her name like it was something fragile. She told him she hadn't come back for the contract, or the money, or the child they had nearly lost before either of them had figured out what they meant to each other. She had come because she needed to know whether the man she met in that house had been real once the deal was gone. Arthur did not answer right away. For a long moment he just looked at her, and Elena could almost see the argument happening behind his eyes. He had spent years mastering control, years learning how to keep his needs hidden behind discipline and silence, and now the one thing he wanted could not be negotiated or purchased or protected by a legal team. Finally, he admitted the truth in the simplest way possible. He told her he didn't know how to ask anyone to stay without fearing that his money, his power, or his disability would twist the request into another kind of pressure. He said he had spent so long being useful to people, suspicious of people, or pitted by people that he no longer knew how to tell the difference between love and dependence. Elena stepped closer and told him, "Then don't ask me to stay because you need me. Ask me because you love me, and let me decide what I want to do with that truth." Arthur looked at her like honesty had cost him enough in life that he no longer knew how to trust it. Then, with none of the polish or coldness she had first met him with, he said the words that had probably been sitting in his chest for weeks. "I love you." No speech, no dramatic apology, just the truth, stripped down to its bones. Elena kissed him before she could overthink it, and for the first time since all of this began, the choice she made belonged entirely to her. What happened afterward did not erase the ugliness of how their story began. Love did not magically rewrite the moral weight of the contract or make the early days of the arrangement noble. Elena never stopped wrestling with that. Arthur didn't either. Some stories don't become beautiful simply because they end with two people choosing each other. Some stories stay complicated forever. But there was a difference now. The next steps of their lives were no longer built on secrecy and desperation. Ruth recovered slowly but well. The house stayed in the family. Arthur began funding a foundation focused on women facing medical debt and coercive reproductive arrangements, though he refused to attach his own pain to every public statement. Elena agreed to build a future with him under one condition: no more decisions made in silence, no more using money as a substitute for vulnerability, and no more disguising control as protection. As for the pregnancy, that part remained private, not because the answer didn't matter, but because by then Elena had learned that not every intimate truth belongs to an audience hungry for a conclusion. The public wanted a scandal, a headline, a neat ending. Life gave them none of those things. And maybe that's the part of Elena Hayes' story that lingers long after the contract, the estate, and the billionaire headlines fade. She walked into Blackwood House believing she was trading one part of herself to save everything else. She believed survival meant making peace with whatever price was demanded as long as the people she loved got to live. But what she learned inside that house was far more uncomfortable than any tabloid version of the story. She learned that desperation can push a person to places they once swore they would never go. She learned that wealth can disguise control as generosity. She learned that love can arrive in the middle of something deeply flawed and still be real. Most of all, she learned that there is a difference between being rescued and being chosen, And if you don't know the difference, the world will gladly decide it for you. Before we go deeper into stories like this on this channel, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But before you leave, sit with this question for a moment, because it's the one at the center of everything Elena lived through. If the money could save your mother, your home, and your entire future, would you have signed that contract? Or is there some price a woman should never agree to pay, no matter how desperate she is?